"We need Mom to sign the papers before Friday," my son whispered inside my daughter's kitchen, and the basket of tomatoes nearly slipped from my hands. I stood frozen on Claire's front porch, staring at the chipped white flower pot beside her door while my heart pounded so hard it felt painful. Just 10 minutes earlier, I had been smiling to myself while driving over with fresh tomatoes from my garden. The late August sun had been warm against my arms, and I remember thinking how proud Harold would have been of this year's harvest. My husband always loved growing tomatoes. He used to say you could tell everything about a family by the way they cared for a garden. Back then I thought he was talking about patience. Standing outside my daughter's house at 68 years old, I finally realized he was talking about roots. "The assisted living place only has one room left," Ethan said quietly inside. "If she waits too long, we lose the opportunity." I stopped breathing for a second. Assisted living. My fingers tightened around the wicker basket. The tomatoes inside shifted softly against one another. Claire lowered her voice, but I could still hear her through the thin kitchen window near the porch. "She's getting forgetful, Ethan. We have to think ahead. And once the farmhouse sells, everything gets easier for all of us." The farmhouse. My farmhouse. The home Harold and I spent 32 years paying off. The house where Ethan learned to ride a bike in the gravel driveway, and Claire used to help me can peaches every summer. I stared at the front door, unable to move. Ethan was supposed to be in Chicago for a business conference. Claire told me that herself 3 days ago while we drank coffee at my kitchen table. Suddenly every conversation from the past few months replayed in my head differently. Claire asking where I kept important papers. Ethan suggesting I should downsize. The way they exchanged quick glances whenever I mentioned fixing up the barn. At the time, I thought they were worried about me living alone after Harold passed last winter. Now I understood something much colder hiding underneath their concern. "She trusts us," Claire said softly. "That's why this has to happen soon." I felt something crack quietly inside my chest then. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, painful shift, like ice breaking under your feet when you realize the lake was never solid to begin with. I should have knocked on the door. I should have walked inside and demanded answers. But I didn't. I just stood there holding that basket of tomatoes while the cicadas buzzed in the distance, and a lawn sprinkler clicked somewhere across the street. "What if she says no?" Ethan asked. Claire laughed softly. "Mom hates conflict. She'll sign if we tell her it's for her safety." For a moment I closed my eyes. I thought about Harold sitting on our porch last summer with dirt on his jeans and sunlight on his silver hair. "Promise me something, Maggie," he had said back then. "Don't let anyone make you feel unnecessary when I'm gone." I didn't understand why he said it at the time. But standing outside my daughter's kitchen, listening to my children plan the end of my life without me, I finally did. Carefully, I bent down and picked up one tomato that had rolled from the basket onto the porch. Then I turned around quietly and walked back to my car without making a sound. The drive home felt longer than usual that afternoon. I kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, while the basket of tomatoes sat untouched on the passenger seat beside me. One of them had split open from where it hit the porch earlier, and the sharp scent of fresh tomato vines filled the car. Normally I loved that smell. It reminded me of late summers with Harold, windows open, country music humming softly through the truck speakers while we hauled produce to the farmer's market every Saturday morning. But that day the smell only made my stomach turn. I pulled into the gravel driveway of the farmhouse just as the sun began sinking behind the old maple trees near the barn. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning. White porch swing, blue shutters, wind chimes Harold bought during our trip to Tennessee 15 years ago. Everything looked peaceful, safe, familiar. And yet I sat in the car for nearly 10 minutes because suddenly the place no longer felt secure. Claire's words kept replaying in my head. "She trusts us." I finally carried the tomatoes inside and placed them on the kitchen counter beside the sink. The kitchen was quiet except for the low humming sound of the refrigerator. Harold used to fill silence so naturally that even after 8 months without him, I still caught myself expecting his footsteps in the hallway, or the sound of his coffee mug touching the table. Grief changes shape over time. First it feels loud and crushing. Later it becomes quieter, smaller, like a stone you carry in your coat pocket every single day. I poured myself a glass of iced tea and sat down at the kitchen table, staring out the window toward the garden. The tomato plants were heavy with fruit this year. Harold would have been proud of them. Ethan always said nobody grew tomatoes like his father. I swallowed hard at the thought of my son because suddenly every memory from the past few months felt different. Back in May, Ethan offered to help organize my paperwork after I misplaced a utility bill. At the time I thought he was being thoughtful. Then there was Claire insisting I write down all my medications on a chart she printed from the internet. She claimed it would help in case of emergencies. A few weeks later, Ethan casually asked whether I had ever considered moving closer to town where things would be easier. Easier for who? I wondered now. I pressed my fingers against my temple as another memory surfaced. 3 Sundays ago, Claire stopped by unexpectedly while I was balancing my checkbook. She smiled too brightly when she noticed the paperwork spread across the table. "You really should let Ethan help with all this financial stuff," she said. "It can get confusing at your age." At your age. The words did not hurt then. They did now. Deeply. I stood up and walked slowly through the house, touching familiar things as I passed. Harold's reading glasses still rested beside his recliner in the living room. His old denim jacket hung by the mudroom door because I had not found the strength to move it yet. In our bedroom, his watch remained on the dresser exactly where he left it the night before his heart attack. 39 years of marriage leave traces everywhere. You do not simply erase a life because someone else decides you have become inconvenient. By evening, the farmhouse felt unusually cold despite the summer heat outside. I made myself a bowl of soup but barely touched it. Around 7:30 my phone rang. Claire. I stared at her name on the screen while my heartbeat quickened. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call completely. But instead I answered calmly. "Hi, sweetheart." "Mom," she said warmly, almost too warmly. "I was thinking maybe you should come over Friday night. Ethan will be in town, and we thought we could all have dinner together." I closed my eyes slowly. Friday. The same deadline Ethan mentioned inside that kitchen earlier. "That sounds lovely," I replied softly. I would not miss it. Friday arrived heavy and humid. The kind of late summer evening where the air sticks to your skin even after sunset. I spent most of the afternoon pretending everything was normal. I watered the tomato plants, folded laundry, swept the porch twice even though it was already clean. The ordinary rhythm of chores helped keep my thoughts steady. Every now and then I caught myself staring toward the gravel road, thinking about turning the car around before I ever reached Claire's house. But I knew I had to go. People reveal the truth more easily when they think you still trust them. Around 5 o'clock, I changed into a light blue blouse Harold once said matched my eyes. The compliment came back to me so clearly that it almost hurt. He used to notice small things like that. The way I pinned my hair up on hot days. The sound of my laugh when I was genuinely happy. Sometimes I think the hardest part of losing someone is realizing how invisible you become afterward. By 6, I was driving toward Claire's neighborhood with a peach cobbler resting carefully on the passenger seat beside me. The same dessert Ethan loved as a boy. I could still picture him standing on a chair in our kitchen at age 8, sneaking spoonfuls of filling while I pretended not to notice. Back then, his face always softened when he looked at me. I wondered when that changed. Claire opened the front door before I even knocked. "Mom," she said brightly, leaning in to hug me. Her perfume smelled expensive and floral. Too strong for such a warm evening. "You did not have to bring dessert." "Old habits," I replied with a small smile. Inside, the house looked immaculate. Candles glowed softly on the dining room table. Wine glasses already poured. A roast chicken rested on the counter beside fresh rosemary potatoes. Everything felt carefully staged, like a photograph in one of those lifestyle magazines Claire always kept on her coffee table. Ethan stood near the kitchen island with his sleeves rolled up. He smiled when he saw me, but it looked forced around the edges. "Hey, Mom." I hugged him anyway. His shoulders felt tense beneath my hands. During dinner, they both acted unusually attentive. Claire kept refilling my iced tea before the glass was even half empty. Ethan asked questions about the garden, about my sleep, about whether the farmhouse stairs had become difficult at night. I answered calmly while quietly studying their faces. Every concern sounded rehearsed. Every smile arrived half a second too late. Halfway through dinner, Claire reached across the table and touched my hand gently. "Mom, Ethan and I have been talking a lot lately about your future. There it was. I set down my fork carefully. My future. Ethan cleared his throat. We just worry about you being alone out there after Dad passed. Dad. Not Harold. Not your husband. The word sounded strangely distant. Claire stood up and walked toward the kitchen counter where a neat stack of papers rested beside her purse. My chest tightened slightly, though I kept my expression calm. She returned and slid the documents across the table toward me with a sympathetic smile. We found a beautiful place about 20 minutes from here, she said softly. It has walking trails, activities, medical staff around the clock. You would not have to worry about maintaining the farmhouse anymore. I looked down at the papers without touching them. Assisted living application forms, property transfer documents, realtor paperwork, all prepared neatly in advance. My fingers rested quietly in my lap while silence settled over the room. Ethan finally spoke. Mom, we are only trying to make things easier for you. Easier. Such a gentle word for something that felt so cruel. I lifted my eyes slowly toward my son. And when exactly, I asked quietly, did the two of you decide I was no longer capable of living my own life? Neither of them answered immediately. And in that silence I finally understood just how long they had been planning this. Claire recovered first. She leaned back slightly in her chair and gave me the same careful smile she used whenever one of the children at church asked an uncomfortable question. Mom, nobody is saying you cannot take care of yourself, she said gently. We are only trying to plan ahead before something happens. Something happens. I noticed how easily she said it, as though aging itself were some kind of emergency waiting to unfold. Ethan stared down into his wine glass instead of looking at me. That hurt more than the paperwork sitting on the table between us. My son had always been terrible at hiding guilt. Even as a little boy, he used to avoid eye contact whenever he stole cookies before dinner. The farmhouse is a lot for one person, he said quietly. The stairs, the maintenance, the distance from town. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate before answering. Your father built those stairs himself, I said. And I have managed that house just fine for 32 years. Neither of them responded immediately. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the ticking clock above Claire's stove. Funny how silence changes once trust disappears. It no longer feels peaceful. It feels loaded. Claire pushed the paperwork slightly closer to me. If you sign now, the transition would be easier. We already spoke with a realtor and the market is perfect right now. Houses in your area are selling fast. There it was again. Not concern. Not safety. Timing. Opportunity. I looked down at the papers more carefully this time. Estimated property value. Listing preparation notes. Financial projections. My farmhouse reduced to numbers typed neatly across expensive white paper. $920,000. Almost laughed at how quickly a lifetime can become a calculation to someone else. My eyes drifted toward the kitchen window behind Claire. Outside, the sky had turned deep orange with sunset. For a moment, I remembered another evening in that same color years ago when Harold and I sat on our porch shelling peas after dinner while Ethan chased fireflies across the yard. Claire was only 10 then, sitting beside me with dirt on her knees and tomato stains on her shirt because she insisted on helping in the garden. One day, Harold said back then, smiling toward the children, this place will always bring them home. I swallowed hard. Maybe that was true. Maybe that was exactly the problem. They did come home. Just not for the reasons we once imagined. Mom! Claire's voice pulled me back. Did you hear what I said? I lifted my eyes slowly toward her. I heard everything. Ethan finally looked at me then, and for the first time all evening, his expression softened slightly. We are not trying to hurt you. I believed he meant that, which somehow made it worse. Cruelty is easier to survive when it comes from anger. But this felt colder. Practical. Organized. Like two people quietly rearranging furniture without noticing they were moving a human life along with it. I stood up slowly from the table and smoothed my blouse with steady hands. Claire blinked in surprise. Mom, where are you going? Home, I answered calmly. I think I need some time before discussing any of this further. Ethan stood immediately. We can drive out tomorrow and help go through some things if you want. Some things. The words settled heavily in my chest. As though Harold's books are wedding photographs, the pencil marks measuring the children's heights inside the pantry doorway were simply clutter waiting to be sorted into boxes. I picked up my purse and paused near the doorway. Then I turned back toward them one last time. "Do you know what the strange thing is?" I asked softly. Claire looked confused. Ethan stayed silent. "I spent my whole life worrying about losing this house after your father died." I glanced toward the paperwork still sitting untouched on the table. It never occurred to me that I would have to worry about losing my children first. That night I did not sleep much. The farmhouse creaked softly around me the way old houses do after midnight, settling into themselves while the world grows quiet outside. I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above the bed Harold and I once shared, replaying every word from dinner over and over in my mind. Around 2 in the morning, a thunderstorm rolled across the valley. Rain tapped steadily against the bedroom windows while flashes of lightning briefly illuminated the walls lined with family photographs. Ethan at his high school graduation, Claire holding her newborn daughter Lily, Christmas mornings, fishing trips, birthdays, decades of memories smiling back at me from polished wooden frames. I wondered how many of those moments had been real, and how many I had simply wanted to believe were real. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the garden soaked and shining under pale sunlight. I carried my coffee onto the porch and sat quietly in Harold's old rocking chair. The air smelled like wet soil and tomato vines. Normally mornings out there brought me peace. That morning I felt something else instead. Clarity. Painful, sharp clarity. Around 10 o'clock my phone rang. I almost ignored it until I saw the name on the screen. Walter Green. Harold's attorney. We had not spoken much since the funeral besides a few routine estate matters. "Margaret," he said warmly after I answered. "I hope I am not calling too early." "Not at all, Walter." There was a brief pause on the line before his tone shifted slightly, more careful. "I debated whether I should mention this, but after several recent conversations with your daughter, I think you deserve to know." My stomach tightened instantly. I stared out toward the garden without speaking. "Claire has contacted my office 3 times in the past month," he continued gently, "mostly asking questions about power of attorney, property transfers, and long-term care arrangements." I closed my eyes slowly. Hearing it from someone else somehow made everything feel colder, more real. "Did she say why?" I asked quietly. Walter hesitated. "She mentioned concerns about your ability to manage the property alone." The rocking chair creaked softly beneath me as I leaned back. Ability. Another polite word people use when they want to take control away from someone older than them. Walter lowered his voice slightly. "Margaret, I have worked with families for over 40 years. Sometimes children genuinely want to help. But sometimes they begin making decisions before the person involved has even agreed to anything." I appreciated that he did not force false comfort onto the situation. "What would you advise?" I asked. "Do not sign anything quickly," he replied firmly. "And if paperwork is placed in front of you again, have your own attorney review every page first. Especially anything involving the farmhouse." My own attorney. The phrase lingered in my mind after the call ended. For so long, I had approached life as part of a family unit. Harold and I together. Then me and the children after he passed. It never occurred to me that one day, I might need protection from my own family. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the property slowly, seeing everything differently now. The old barn with faded red paint. The tire swing Ethan's father hung from the oak tree when he was 6. The flower beds Claire helped me plant every spring when she was little. So much love had been poured into that land over the years that it almost seemed impossible for greed to exist there too. Yet somehow both things lived side by side now. Near sunset, I stopped beside the tomato garden and gently touched one of the ripening vines. Harold always said tomatoes teach patience because they ripen in their own time no matter how badly you want to rush them. Standing there alone in the fading light, I realized something else takes time too. The moment when a person finally stops pretending not to see the truth. The following week, I behaved exactly the way Claire expected me to behave. I answered her calls warmly. I thanked Ethan for checking in. I even laughed softly when Claire sent me a photo of a retirement community garden with the message, "Does this not look peaceful?" If either of them noticed the distance in my voice, they chose not to mention it. People hear what they want to hear when they are busy convincing themselves they are right. On Wednesday morning, I drove into town earlier than usual. The courthouse clock downtown had just struck 9 when I parked outside a small brick office building near Main Street. Harper & Mills Legal Services. I sat in the car for a moment staring at the gold lettering on the glass door while nervousness settled heavily in my stomach. I had never hired an attorney on my own before. Harold always handled those things. But Harold was gone now, and grief does not protect you from reality. Inside, the office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Framed black and white photographs of the town from decades ago lined the hallway walls. A young receptionist greeted me kindly before leading me into a quiet office where a woman around my daughter's age stood to shake my hand. "Margaret Holloway?" she asked warmly. "I am Rebecca Mills." There was something steady about her voice that immediately put me at ease. No false pity. No exaggerated gentleness. Just professionalism. I appreciated that more than she probably realized. Rebecca listened quietly while I explained everything. Claire's sudden concern. Ethan discussing assisted living behind my back. The paperwork at dinner. Walter's warning about power of attorney. I expected embarrassment while speaking the words aloud, but instead I mostly felt tired. Deeply tired. Rebecca folded her hands carefully once I finished. "You are not legally obligated to sign anything," she said firmly. "And based on what you are describing, I would strongly advise against transferring property ownership right now." I nodded slowly. Hearing someone say it plainly helped more than I expected. "Can my children force me into assisted living?" I asked quietly. The question tasted bitter coming out of my mouth. Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "Not unless you are declared incapable of making your own decisions, and from what I see sitting in front of me, that is clearly not the case." For the first time in days, I felt my lungs fully expand again. Rebecca turned her computer monitor slightly toward me. "There are ways to protect both yourself and your property if that is what you want." Protect yourself. The phrase echoed strangely inside me. Mothers spend so much of their lives protecting everyone else that they rarely imagine needing protection themselves. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing documents together. Property records. Harold's will. Bank accounts. At one point, Rebecca looked up and asked gently, "Margaret, what do you actually want to happen to the farmhouse?" The answer came immediately. "I want it to stay alive." She tilted her head slightly, waiting for me to continue. I looked out her office window toward the town square where children ran past the fountain with ice cream cones melting down their hands. "That house was never just a house," I said softly. "People gathered there. Harvest dinners. School fundraisers. Church picnics. Harold loved that." My throat tightened briefly before I continued. "I do not want it turned into somebody's investment opportunity." Rebecca smiled faintly then. "In that case," she said, pulling a folder toward her, "I think we should discuss a trust." When I finally stepped back outside into the afternoon sunlight, the air felt cooler somehow despite the August heat. For the first time since overhearing my children in Claire's kitchen, I no longer felt helpless. Hurt, yes. Heartbroken, absolutely. But helpless? No. As I walked back toward my car, I realized something important. Claire and Ethan believed they were quietly planning my future for me. What they did not realize was that I had finally started planning my own. By the following Sunday, Claire and Ethan seemed almost relieved around me again. I suppose they took my silence as surrender. People often mistake calmness for weakness because they cannot imagine someone quietly thinking 3 steps ahead. Claire invited herself over that afternoon carrying a store-bought pie and wearing the bright, cheerful expression she always used when trying to manage a situation. "I thought we could spend some time together," she said as she walked into the kitchen. "You have seemed stressed lately." I smiled politely and poured coffee into Harold's favorite mugs. The same blue ceramic ones we bought during a road trip through Vermont years ago. Claire glanced around the farmhouse while stirring cream into her coffee. I noticed how her eyes lingered on things now. The antique dining cabinet. The exposed ceiling beams Harold restored by hand. The wide kitchen windows overlooking the garden. She was not looking at memories anymore. She was calculating value. "This place really is too much for one person," she said casually. You could have such an easier life somewhere smaller. Easier. There was that word again. I carried my cup onto the back porch, and after a moment Claire followed. The tomato garden stretched across the yard in neat rows glowing deep red beneath the afternoon sun. Cicadas buzzed lazily in the trees while a warm breeze moved through the fields behind the barn. Harold used to call this porch the heart of the house because every important conversation in our family eventually happened there. Claire sat across from me and crossed her legs carefully. "Mom," she began gently, "I hope you know Ethan and I only want what is best for you." I looked at my daughter for a long moment before answering. She really did believe that in her own way. That was the tragedy of it. Somewhere between ambition and convenience, she had convinced herself that taking control of my life was kindness. "Do you remember when your father built the garden boxes?" I asked quietly. Claire blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Sort of. You were 12, I continued. You insisted on helping even though the hammer was almost too heavy for you to hold." Her expression softened slightly despite herself. "Dad let me paint the signs." "You painted crooked letters on every single one," I said with a faint smile. "Tomatoes. Basil. Peppers." Claire laughed softly then. For a brief moment, I saw my little girl again instead of the polished woman sitting across from me calculating property values. "Dad was patient about things like that," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "He believed people should be allowed to grow at their own pace." Silence settled gently between us. Claire looked down at her coffee cup before finally speaking again. "Mom, you cannot stay here forever." There it was. Not concern anymore. Not suggestions. A conclusion already made. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "And who decided that?" Claire sighed softly, like someone exhausted from carrying a burden nobody asked them to carry. "You are 68. You live alone 30 minutes from town. What happens if you fall? What happens if something goes wrong?" I studied her carefully before answering. "Something already did go wrong, Claire." Her face tightened slightly. "What does that mean?" I looked out toward the garden where the tomato vines swayed lightly in the wind. "It means somewhere along the way, my children stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a problem to solve." Claire opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself. The truth does that sometimes. It leaves people with nothing prepared to say. A few minutes later, Ethan's truck pulled into the driveway. He stepped out carrying another stack of folders under one arm. Even from the porch, I recognized the same paperwork from dinner the week before. Claire noticed my expression and immediately stood up. "Mom, do not overthink this," she said quickly. "We are only trying to help." I watched my son walk toward the house while the evening sunlight stretched long shadows across the garden Harold built with his own hands. Then I looked back at my daughter and smiled very gently. "That is the strange thing about help," I said softly. "Real help does not usually arrive with contracts attached to it." 2 days later, I signed the final documents inside Rebecca Mills's office while soft rain tapped against the windows downtown. Rebecca slid the papers toward me one by one, carefully explaining each section even though by then I already understood exactly what I wanted. The farmhouse, the land, the gardens, and Harold's workshop would all be placed into a protected trust. After my passing, the property would become the Holloway Community Garden and Education Center, a place where local families and schoolchildren could gather, learn gardening, and hold seasonal farmers markets. The only family member involved in managing it would be my granddaughter Lily after she turned 25, if she still wished to do so. Rebecca adjusted her glasses slightly as I finished signing the final page. "You are certain about this?" she asked gently. I nodded without hesitation. More certain than I have been about anything in a long time. The truth surprised even me a little. For weeks, I had moved through grief and betrayal feeling as though the ground beneath my life had shifted. But sitting there in that quiet office, I finally felt steady again. Not because the pain was gone. It was not. But because I had stopped waiting for someone else to protect what mattered to me. When I returned home that afternoon, the farmhouse looked different somehow. Not because anything had changed physically, but because for the first time in months the house no longer felt vulnerable. The porch swing moved gently in the breeze. Rainwater dripped from the roof gutters. Somewhere behind the barn, thunder rumbled softly in the distance. Home. Still mine. That evening, Lily stopped by unexpectedly after her college classes. At 19, she had Harold's quiet eyes and thoughtful nature. Unlike the rest of the family, she never rushed through conversations or stared at her phone while speaking to you. She sat beside me at the kitchen table eating tomato soup while rain streaked across the windows. "Mom says you are considering moving," she said carefully after a while. I stirred my soup slowly before answering. "Your mother says many things lately." Lily gave me a small uncertain smile. "I do not think she realizes how much this place means to you." I looked at my granddaughter for a long moment then. There was no calculation in her face. No agenda. Just concern. Real concern. "Do you know what your grandfather used to say about this house?" I asked softly. Lily shook her head. "He said a home is supposed to make people feel safe enough to become themselves." Her expression softened. "That sounds like Grandpa." I smiled faintly. "Yes, it does." We spent the next hour looking through old photo albums together, while the storm continued outside. Pictures of Harold teaching Ethan to fish. Claire at 14 holding a basket of tomatoes almost bigger than she was. Christmas mornings crowded into this very kitchen. Lily laughed quietly at some of the hairstyles from the 1980s, and for the first time in weeks, the sound warmed the room instead of hurting it. Before leaving, she paused near the front door. "Grandma." "Yes. If you ever decide you need help around here, I hope you know I would actually want to help." The words hit me harder than she probably intended, because real love does not pressure. It does not manipulate. It does not arrive carrying transfer papers and hidden plans. Real love simply shows up and asks what you need. After Lily left, I turned off the kitchen lights and stood quietly by the window overlooking the dark garden outside. Raindrops shimmered on the tomato vines beneath the porch light. Harold once told me gardens survive because someone keeps tending them even after storms. Looking out across the land we built together, I realized something important. My children thought they were fighting over property, but they never understood what they were truly standing on. Roots. And roots run deeper than greed ever will. 3 weeks later, Claire called and asked me to meet her and Ethan at Walter Green's office on Friday morning. Her voice carried that same polished calmness she always used when she believed things were finally going her way. "We just need to finalize a few things," she said lightly over the phone. "Nothing stressful." I stood at the kitchen sink after the call ended, looking out toward the tomato garden glowing beneath the early September sunlight. Several vines were beginning to droop from the weight of the season's final harvest. Harold always loved this time of year most. He used to say September tells the truth about what was planted in spring. Friday morning arrived cool and bright. I wore a cream-colored sweater Harold bought me years ago during an anniversary trip to Asheville. The same sweater Claire once borrowed in college because she said it smelled like home. Funny how memory works. Certain details stay soft even after everything else changes. Walter greeted us warmly when we arrived at his office downtown. Ethan looked nervous the moment he saw me, though Claire maintained her confident smile. She carried a leather folder against her chest while Ethan avoided my eyes entirely. We sat around the long conference table together while sunlight streamed through the tall office windows. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Claire cleared her throat gently. "Mom, we know this process has probably been emotional for you," she began carefully. "But once the property paperwork is complete, everything will become much simpler." Simpler. Again that word. I folded my hands calmly in my lap and said nothing. Walter adjusted the papers in front of him slowly before speaking. "Actually," he said evenly, "there have been some recent changes regarding the Holloway property." Claire's smile faded slightly. Ethan finally looked up. Walter opened a thick folder and continued. "Mrs. Holloway established a protected trust last week, transferring the farmhouse and surrounding land into the Holloway Community Garden and Education Center effective immediately upon her passing." Silence filled the room so completely I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock behind Walter's desk. Claire blinked first. "I am sorry," she said stiffly. "What does that mean exactly?" Walter remained calm. "It means the property cannot be sold privately by family members, nor can ownership be transferred outside the trust." Ethan stared at me now with open confusion. "Mom, you already made a decision?" I met my son's eyes steadily. "Yes." Claire leaned forward sharply in her chair. Without even discussing it with us? There it was at last. Not grief. Not concern. Offense. As though my own life required their approval. I looked at my daughter quietly for several seconds before answering. You discussed my future without me first. Her face tightened immediately. Ethan rubbed one hand across his forehead, looking exhausted suddenly. Mom, we were trying to help. I believed he still believed that himself. That was the saddest part. Walter slid another document gently across the table. Mrs. Holloway also designated Lily Holloway Bennett as future managing trustee should she choose to accept the responsibility later in life. Claire's expression changed instantly at the mention of her daughter's name. Shock first, then anger. Lily, she repeated softly. I nodded, because Lily was the only person who asked what I wanted instead of deciding it for me. Nobody spoke after that. Outside the office windows, leaves drifted slowly across Main Street while traffic moved quietly through town below us. Ordinary life continuing as though nothing monumental had just happened inside that room. Ethan finally looked at me again, and this time his voice sounded smaller somehow. Younger. You really thought we would take everything from you? I held his gaze gently. No, I said softly. I thought you already had. Claire looked away first. Ethan lowered his eyes to the table. And in that long, heavy silence, I realized something unexpected. I no longer felt angry. Grief remained. Disappointment remained. But anger had quietly left somewhere along the way. Because the truth was, the farmhouse had never truly been about ownership. It was about legacy. About love. About roots deep enough to survive difficult seasons. As I stepped outside Walter's office later that morning, cool autumn wind moved softly through the town square. For the first time in nearly a year, I lifted my face toward the sunlight and felt something peaceful settle inside me. Harold had been right all along. A family, like a garden, reveals itself eventually by what it chooses to nurture.